Welcome, everyone, and thank you for tuning in. We're really pleased to have Tom Wetzel joining us to discuss Overcoming Capitalism. For those of you who are brand new and you've never heard of us before, we are Lost City Books, an independent bookstore in the heart of Adams Morgan, Washington, D.C. We specialize in used, new, and rare books. So if you ever get the opportunity to walk into our store, you'll find a really carefully curated collection of books, both new and used, and a couple of cool rare beauties as well. Our new space, which we renovated in 2020, generates engagement and enrichment from the surrounding community, inviting artists, activists, organizers, of course, authors, and educators, many of which are reflected in our staff from the area and now the nation and internationally, to share their knowledge and skills and stories. About our author this evening, Tom Wetzel has written on labor history, worker struggles, libertarian socialist ideas, and housing struggles since the 1970s. He has been published in ZNet and Roar magazine and is a former editor of the anarcho-syndicalist magazine Ideas in Action, where many of his essays were published. He resides in Hayward, California. And without anything further, welcome, Tom.
Hi, thank you. Good to be here.
It's such a pleasure to have you, and I'm really excited to dig into this book a little bit, but I'd like to hear a little bit about your background first and sort of to give our viewers a bit of context about you and about this book.
Well, I've done a lot of different things over the years. I was a graduate student at UCLA back in the 70s and helped build the first TAs union there. Got my PhD in philosophy and taught that for some years before I left the academic world. Then I, worked in the computer industry, worked as a typesetter and weekly paper, did union organizing in these kinds of settings over, many years, and was also was active within the Missionary Displacement Coalition in 2000, which was a major anti-eviction struggle. And coming out of that, we built a community land trust in San Francisco to basically use it as a tool, an anti-eviction tool, to convert rental buildings into cooperatives so that the residents would be sort of continue to have permanently affordable housing kind of cemented in place so they couldn't be evicted or kicked out, Those are some of the things that I've done.
Amazing. It sounds like you've been really involved in this work for some decades now. So I'm excited to kind of get into some of your insights and the things that you've learned over the years. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about Overcoming Capitalism, how this work came to be and the issues at hand. I know that it's weighing heavily on a lot of people's minds, especially recently, as the coronavirus pandemic kind of maybe pulled back the veil for a lot of people. So I'm interested to get into that.
Okay. The book, my book starts out with sort of building the case against capitalism. Okay, the idea is we were going to get rid of it, but why? What is the justification? And I think that's important in terms of providing people with motivation and feeling that they're doing the right thing, And so I'll just talk about a couple of the destructive, oppressive features of capitalism that I talk about here. I begin with sort of a basic distinction between freedom and oppression, because I want to talk about what the structures of oppression are within the capitalist societies built on oppression. So the way I understand it is that I'm talking about here positive freedom is the ability of people to actually control the decisions that affect them. So like in workplaces, to be able to actually run the workplace, to control their own labor, right? And to control all the decisions of the community, the larger community that affects them. So, and another aspect of positive liberty is having access, equal access to the kinds of resources that you need for your personal development, for building your skills and maintaining your health and so forth, because you need to have these things in order to be self-managing in the world, to be able to control your participation in the community and work and so forth. So I define oppression basically as institutional structures that, or past systematic patterns in society that systematically diminish or suppress positive freedom for particular groups of people. So if we talk about class oppression in particular, which I start out with, the basic working class situation is that we don't have our own means to a livelihood. So, we're forced essentially to seek jobs from employers, because if we don't, well, there's dire consequences. We can't pay the rent, can't buy food. And and then when we get these jobs, the employers, of course, take advantage of the situation to impose autocratic managerial regimes over us, so that in the workplace, workers are denied any say. We don't have any right to a say over our own, over the labor process, over how our abilities are put to use, over, how the workplace in general is run. And so right there, you have basically the core of class oppression, which is inherent to capitalism, because that's how the capitalists make profit. They, through this control over us, they then are able to extract profit out of our labor. And thus, their profits are based on exploitation, since it's based on an illegitimate system of oppression of others. And, within this capitalist system, of course, there are some subgroups of the working class. They're not all oppressed in the same way. Some are subject to other forms of oppression. So you can have groups that have been racialized, or there's gendered inequalities built into the system too, right? And so these are not separate; they're like inherent into the workplace. You have things like discrimination, harassment in the workplace. So we have a system then generally which is grounded in and built on various forms of oppressions, and its core is class oppression and exploitation. So and I think getting rid of that, and going over to society built around self-management, people being able to control their work, control their lives, that right there sort of provides a motivation for thinking about, well, why do we want to get rid of it? The second point I wanted to make was the other feature that's highly destructive of capitalism is its cost shifting dynamic, because based on markets and private property, the firms are constantly trying to figure out how they can reduce their expenses. Well, one way to do that is to shift costs onto others. So you have a coal burning power firm, right? They're going to be putting out all these emissions that are destructive to people's respiratory systems and contribute to global warming. And there's pollution and so forth. There's another example of cost shifting. And now today, of course, this has developed into an increasing level of devastation, looking to like almost apocalyptic potential costs for humanity down the road, not too far. So these, I think, are at least two of the motivations we have for wanting to get rid of capitalism, right? Is it does these things. It's a system that has this basis. So, so then how do we do that? How do we get rid of capitalism? And that brings us to the question of strategy, which is really the main thing I talk about in my book. And I have a number of chapters that try to evaluate the main strategies the radical leftists proposed over the years, such as cooperativism and electoral socialism, but socialism through the ballot box. And but in particular, what I'm trying to do, and my main purpose in writing this book, was to explain and defend a contemporary version of syndicalism, which is another revolutionary strategy, another strategy for getting us out of capitalism. And so I usually define syndicalism as having three basic components, okay? So one is in terms of the methods of action, the strategies, that's an element of strategy, is what kind of tactics and methods of action do you use? What are you proposing? So syndicalism is based on the idea of mass participation in collective disruptive actions, like strikes, building occupations, rent strikes, shutting down the flow of profits to the employer, shutting down business as usual for government agencies and so on. The second element is what I call self-managed unionism. That means that workers form unions that they directly control and retain control of. So we don't allow control to be shifted or concentrated off to some, bureaucracy of paid officials and staff. And so this means that the control resides in things like the general meetings of the workers' assemblies, the election of delegates or shop stewards who are there in the workplace, and their co-workers who are helping to coordinate and mobilize resistance on an ongoing basis against management, against the employers. And for larger scale forms of action and coordination, you can have things like coordinating councils, which where delegates are elected from different workplaces to coordinate through a whole company, for example. And and all the various aspects of running the union are controlled by the workers. So you have how to handle the grievances, the negotiating of agreements, that's done through elected negotiating committees. And of course, you're going to need, in order to do this, some means of popular education, of training, so that the active workers in the union can be trained in how to do all these things, how to run their own union, so they don't become dependent upon some separate bureaucracy. Because separate bureaucracies generally tend to develop their own interests and tend to get in the way of advancing the struggle. And the third element in syndicalism is the widening out and deepening of solidarity. So between the different subgroups within the working class population. And this includes, of course, connections and links between different groups of workers, different unions, but also the capitalist system has various different fault lines in it. And there are various kinds of movements that will develop in resistance along these fault lines, whether it be, the global warming, whether it be evictions of tenants, raising of rents, racist policing, whatever. There are different kinds of movements and groups. So the idea here of widening and broadening the solidarity is to get these groups together to talk to each other, develop links, and over the long run, hopefully build a kind of what I call a social movement alliance, a kind of coalition that through adopting from each other and understanding each other's grievances and goals, you build a kind of common program for change. And so that's my conception of syndicalism. And I think that I would give two arguments in favor of it. One is that I think that it does the best job of furthering the process that people call class formation. And I use class formation as a criterion for evaluating strategies in general. By class formation, I mean the following. I mean, like the working class does not at any given time have automatically the ability to actually get rid of capitalism. We don't right now have that power or capacity. So how do we develop it? Well, that's a process of building, of education, of development over time. So class formation is the protracted process, more or less protracted, in which working class does things like overcomes internal divisions, like around race and gender, develops greater cohesion, develops more links among the various subgroups of the working class, and develops its skills and its understanding of the system, builds its confidence, and develops the organizational strength and aspirations for change so that it can pose an actual threat, it has the actual power, right, to challenge the dominating classes for control of the society and propose a different kind of arrangement for the society. So, and I think that syndicalism, because it's based on mass participation in democratic organization, democratic mass organization, and mass struggle participation in that it does the best job of building the sense of power, that we have the power to change society. And I think that it has, syndicalism has one other advantage, one other argument in favor of it, apart from its being helpful in the development of class formation, but also because we have to think about what we're going for, what we're aiming at. And one of the problems of the socialist movement in the 20th century was we ended up, there ended up being these communist party controlled regimes that were very repressive, where the promise of liberation of the working class didn't happen because the working class continued to be subordinate and oppressed, in this case by a new class, a class of political apparatchiks and elite planners and managers and military brass, a kind of bureaucratic control class, as they call it. So it didn't really, so because the historic goal of the socialist movement was, going back to Marx and the 19th century, was the self-emancipation of the working class. It didn't happen. So in that sense, the Marxist-Leninist movement was a failure. So we want to avoid that. So how do we avoid that? Well, I think we have the best shot to avoid that if the force that's pushing change, and particularly through periods of increasing levels of struggle, is mass democratic organizations that are controlled by the participants and have a democratic culture, because then that produces, a movement with a democratic culture, with mass democratic organizations like unions being the actual organizations that control the process of change, gives us a really good shot of ending up with a democratic, self-managed, and hopefully ecologically protected form of socialism.
Excellent, thank you. When we talk about syndicalism, if you want to expand on that a little bit, when we're talking about syndicalism and what coalition building looks like, for example, from the 1970s compared to now, what do you notice are sort of some of the barriers to what we call the working class now, and to sort of that class of people uniting, and how are they different from 50 years ago when, for example, technology didn't have us all simultaneously more connected than ever, but also more inundated with misdirection and misinformation than ever?
Well, there have been some changes, but I think some of the changes actually, it seems to me, work in our favor. For example, if you look at the development of large workplaces, places like Amazon or large supermarkets and hospitals and so forth, the workforce has become incredibly diverse. So that in order to be able to build unions there, people have to have huge numbers of conversations and overcome misconceptions about each other, right? And so if you look at, for example, the recent victory of Amazon labor union in New York City, that's an incredibly diverse workforce they have there. And their victory really sort of vindicates what I'm saying, because they started out from the beginning with the idea of being an independent worker-controlled union. That's how they operate, right? And right when they won that election, then their next step was electing shop stewards, electing the president and other officers. And so the idea was to build a worker-controlled independent labor organization. And I think that the advantage we have in doing that today, like I was saying, was just simply the great diversity, the huge diversity of the workforce. And those people, because people will have links to various different community organizations, different communities, right? And different kinds of organizations. So that really can potentially, I think, help to build this kind of coalition building. So I think that really it puts us in a better situation than we were back in like the 60s, 70s period, I think. When I think that, I don't think that the workforce is quite as diverse in many cases as it is now.
I think you brought up a fascinating point there about the diversity of the workforce, meaning that the workforce is by nature connected to a variety of other community organizations, just by the fact that, if you have Black and Latino and white workers all working together, LGBTQ men and women and other genders working together, all of their respective communities have their own support organizations that are then that are often, at least in the case of workers' rights and labor rights, advocating for their particular needs as part of that group. And I wonder if you have sort of more to say about that and what you've observed about what other community organizations have to offer to labor movements.
Well, it depends on really what the issue is that the workers themselves are interested in, because different unions, depending on the situation of the people in that union, have tried to develop, for example, connections to tenant organizations and affordable housing organizations, because housing is that's a big issue for them. And I know at least of some unions that have also gotten very much involved in the struggles against police brutality. Or again, because some of their members, like some of their Black members, have been subjected to police violence, And so, again, it's because of what you were just saying about the connections to different communities that there's not like an impervious wall between the workplace and the larger community. People are part of, and they maybe linked to or know about other organizations that then they can develop links. But it depends, as I was saying, on the particular issues that are foremost in the thinking of the groups of workers who are there. And that's going to, differ from place to place.
Definitely, definitely that's true. And we've seen, as you mentioned with the Amazon Union in New York, we've seen some incredible successes with union building through those efforts. But something I've also noticed is that sort of corporate ruling class forces have also developed really strong anti-labor movements, if you can call them that, or at least anti-labor movements at the large scale. And something I was discussing with one of your pressmate who wrote Gang Politics, Christian Williams, we were discussing about how corporations now have the buying power of a government, of the nation. And I wonder if you have some thoughts on how that has empowered them to be disruptive to labor movements, and what you have seen labor movements and workers' rights movements respond to that with.
Yeah, that's been developing since the 70s. You've had the increasingly the development of these anti-labor consultancies, which get heavily funded, hundreds of millions of dollars a year, and all kinds of repressive tactics and monitoring tactics and stuff that are used to suppress union efforts. And I think that if you look at, like, for example, the Amazon labor union example, again, they had to deal with this, and they used every conceivable way they could to get some kind of connection, have a conversation with other workers, and also in many cases, it requires definitely, and certainly initially, the workers be really quite secretive and sub rosa about the initial organizing, precisely because the employers will come down with a load of bricks on top of them if they don't. And they have the wherewithal to do that, So it's going to take, that's part of it. And also eventually, the unions, another factor here is that the labor laws in this country are really extremely repressive, in the sense that all the most effective actions that workers could do have been essentially made illegal. And so, like, a secondary boycott, or a solidarity strike, or there are lots of different kinds of actions, or a sit-down strike, which is actually the most effective kind of strike. These have been made illegal. So what you're going to need, essentially, are unions are going to have to be built and have the ability to roll over those laws, to violate them and get away with it. And that's part of doing that is, for example, if it's a grassroots union that doesn't have like big buildings and doesn't have lots of resources, then they're not going to be the way the unions are, the union officials one of the reasons they come down against these kinds of actions is they're afraid of their assets being attached, huge fines, things like that. So the unions, you have to have unions that have the ability to violate the law and get away with it. And part of that also is, again, coming back to this question of the links within the community. So you can build on and develop the potential for solidarity, different groups of people being brought into action. If more repressive actions by the employers are taken. So again, I think that this question of the labor community linkages is really going to be, I think, increasingly important. And this is to get around the repressive efforts that are going to be directed against unionism.
Thank you. I'll take a moment to pause here and invite our viewers. If you have any questions for Tom, you can type them as a comment in the video that you're watching right now, and we'll get to those in just a few minutes. I wanted to pivot a little bit here as well and talk about, we're talking about the labor movements and what capitalist forces have done to worker movements and to workers. But can we talk a little bit about what capitalism as a force, especially in the last 50 to 60 years, has done to the health of our society, especially in the United States?
Well, you have increasing, insofar as you have like decreasing regulation of like the food industry, the pharmaceutical industry, chemical industry, you have increasingly serious problems which already existed of pollution, and the attacks upon any kind of public health system. And particularly, this affects poorer, sort of more rural parts of the country where you have just a elimination often of healthcare options for people. And so there's that. Then there's also the whole thing about the tendency of the last 40 years is work intensification. So like, and what's that's going to do? What commuter monitoring and computer-based work intensification schemes, forcing people to work more continuously and not allowing like downtime. What that's going to do is in terms of like, that's damaging in terms of stress on people, which affects their health over the long run. Like if you consider like a warehouse, for example, it used to be like pickers they would pick an order for a particular customer, and then they would have like a couple minutes before they would get a new order. Well, now they have these computerized systems where they can figure out immediately when you're done, and then give you a new order right away. So they never have they never have any rest, they never have any downtime. And these things are destructive to health of the workers there. So there's that. And of course, then there's the the damaging impacts from the growing levels of pollution and global warming, and potential additional pandemics in the future, which the globalization, the way capitalism's globalized characters worked, makes them more of a problem, because it links the whole world together, and so pandemics are likely to spread more quickly. So yeah, there are definitely damaging impacts to capitalist development and globalization in recent decades.
I think it's interesting that you bring that up, because in the past couple of years, I personally have noticed, and I think it's noticeable, that more of the average person has become aware of what the impact that capitalism has had on every aspect of their lives. And it's become especially keen in the midst of this pandemic that we're in. This one, we'll see what happens on the next one. But as people have lost work, lost housing, they have had to really face the failures of our healthcare system, and they're kind of sitting back and watching the government continue to fail to do its job. And something that has been brought up to me by people who do not yet live in the United States and maybe live in other countries that have, where the citizens have a better hold on their government, so to speak. The question is always, what are United Statesians, what are Americans missing about their role in the elimination of capitalism, as it were, or in the radical change of the way that the government behaves towards its citizens and how it takes care of us if it could do that.
Yeah, I think for one thing that one of the ways in which the system is becoming more and more illegitimate in the eyes of the population is the way in which our governmental system has become increasingly dysfunctional, and destructive. And you have even the problem of like the Republican Party evolving into some kind of fascist party that doesn't accept democratic elections unless they overthrow them. Even if you went back earlier in time, the U.S. has a particularly not really very democratic system, because like the U.S. Senate, which ends up being a block to progress, 18% of the population elect half the senators. And these are people in like smaller rural states. So you have reactionary forces have a hold, sort of a structural hold, and they can also filter who gets appointed to the Supreme Court, which acts, and then the federal judiciary has a kind of dictatorial power of making edicts, and making law. And it makes it very difficult actually for us within the institutions that we have to have an impact. And this is again another reason why I say that the struggle for change is going to have to primarily be based upon building movements that are sort of extra electoral, outside of electoral politics, that can gain enough numbers and visibility and power and ability to shut things down, to develop a force that's independent of and can get around the dysfunctional and undemocratic political system that we have.
Precisely that. And it's been mentioned before, but the United States is just so big. It's a huge country with such a huge diversity of ideas and people and needs, and landscapes for that matter. And the lives that people live in rural areas are very different from the life that I live here in Washington, D.C., for example. And you hit the nail on the head there, where what is it? You said 18% of the population elected half the senators. So there's one of our first problems. And we have a few questions rolling into the chat here. I'll remind our viewers that you can add your questions as a comment below the video that you're watching right now, and we'll get to them in about 5 minutes. But I'd like to pivot back a little bit to talking about the book, about Overcoming Capitalism, and sort of what you chose to include in the book, and what different sections, why it felt like they matter to include and are important to share with the readers.
Well, the first part of the book is basically the critique of the system, and so I have chapters on explaining oppression and freedom and class oppression. I have a chapter on the basis of racial inequality in the U.S. and its history with respect to U.S. capitalism. I have a chapter on work intensification that I talked about. I have a chapter on the highly undemocratic nature of the U.S. governmental scheme, which I've also talked about, and then a chapter on the cost-shifting dynamic, which is leading to ecological devastation. Those are kind of the critique of the system chapters, but I also have 5 chapters on strategies. So I have a chapter on cooperativism, where I look at the pros and cons of that, and a chapter on the labor movement and its historically kind of internally contradictory or conflicted character, where you have had both huge uprisings of large numbers of new self-managed unions built, like in the early 30s and in World War I era. And then you have, like, since the Second World War, intensified bureaucratization. So understanding that dynamic, and I have also a chapter on the Marxist-Leninist movement historically, and my going back to the Russian Revolution, my critique of that. And then the last chapter, which is the longest chapter, is a kind of sketching out the ideas of a libertarian form of eco-socialism based on workers' self-management of industries, as well as direct participation by people in community assemblies and community-based organizations to do planning for, like, what kind of public goods and services they want, and to, control, give them control over the use of the ecological commons so they can prevent being polluted on, and ensure basic accountability of the production system. So it's what I call a dual governance model, in the sense that you have both workers' self-management of the various industries, but you also have the means of the population directly organized in communities for their own planning. Those are kind of the components of the book.
Excellent, yeah. And something you mentioned earlier kind of rang back to me just then as you were describing some of the strategic chapters about the sort of systematic dismantling of those community-based movements. And something I've observed lately in the past, I don't know, 10 years is a really strong resurgence of mutual aid communities, for example, and community organizations that are non-government affiliated and are not, don't have the stamp of approval necessarily even of the law. And I won't name any because some of them are just barely skirting around that threat of violence. But have you noticed that, for example, in the 80s and 90s, there was a really strong public ideal of hyper-individualism, which was deeply linked to capitalism. And it was kind of moving away from the civil rights era, where the government actively dismantled civil rights organizations that were largely based in mutual aid actions as well. For example, the Black Panther Party comes to mind, where, yes, they were all about, protecting Black communities from unjust police violence and state violence. They were also running free lunch programs and breakfast programs. They were feeding single parents and feeding families who were under the poverty line. They were labor organizing. And we noticed that the Black Panther Party was systematically dismantled and its leaders assassinated and things like that around the same time that they began to form a coalition with Appalachian coal miners, right? And as those things started to happen, that is when the government said, why don't we stop that? Why don't we nip that one in the bud? So that was a very long-winded way of getting back around to the present day. And now we see a lot of justice movements are deeply linked with labor movements, deeply linked with mutual aid movements, and deeply linked with just community care movements that are sort of taking the needs of the community into their own hands. I wonder if you notice the same thing, if you have any thoughts about sort of that historical line, through line, and any predictions about how that might go depending on the power of the people, so to speak.
Yeah, and there's a kind, that these kinds of movements have developed to some extent. I think that it still has a long ways to go as far as mutual aid organizations and are concerned. And I think that hyper-individualism, what I've noticed especially there, is that has like become concentrated, extremely concentrated. If you follow like the Republican ideology, they have like totally, made that into some kind of an very extreme, even unrealistic, unreal sort of component of their ideology, like moving back to the 19th century, to social Darwinism, where you don't want any kind of public benefits for anyone, and so there is kind of that extremist form of individualism, and it's really central to their politics, their appeal, because they're against any kind of public or social benefits, that in particular benefit systems that would benefit the people they don't like, people they hate, and gay people or black people or whoever their particular, dislike is. But I still think that there's a long ways to go in terms of, for one thing, because we've seen one of the problems that we've had with movements is we've seen big explosions, but they have not been able to sustain themselves. So like with Occupy, was suppressed by the police in a number of cities. And then there was like Black Lives Matters protests in 2020 were very extensive, really huge. But so there's a question of how do we develop the ability to sustain that kind of participation and sustain these movements over time. I think that we have to think about what kind of organization it would do that, would help to do that, And that's why that was one of the reasons why I sort of was saying that was an argument in favor of grassroots unions, because it's an ongoing, formally organized organization, a formally democratic organization that can maintain the resistance to the employer. Because, struggles wax and wane, people get more into action in certain periods than others. But you have to be able to sustain the movement over time. And that I think is something we have to think about, how to do that.
Absolutely. And it's definitely also about sustaining the needs of the people participating in these actions. And I have hope, I have hope. But I see that we have a ton of questions in our comment section, so we can hop over to some of these questions here. One of them is, when did you discover Marx's work? If you feel that is a relevant question.
Probably when I was in my late teens or early 20s. I know that one of the first books that I was a Republican in my youth, by the way. I belonged to the Young Republicans. This is when I was a teenager, But I think then I started, getting, because I was a blue collar worker and I'm subject to, the oppressive control of management. And so became interested in the question of how does the working class liberate itself from that. And I read, one of the books I read was Bertrand Russell's Roads to Freedom, which is it was kind of an inspiration for me, because he has a chapter on the different radical politics there, like Marxism. So I read a chapter on Marxism there, and Huysmans' anarchist communism, syndicalism. And I think when I became a teaching assistant and a graduate student in the early 70s, and one of the things that we did with some of my other students, and some of the other people I was in this program with, was we organized a reading group in reading Marx's philosophical manuscripts of 1844, which is where he lays out the whole concept of alienated labor, and which is a central component of class oppression. And so that's kind of when I began to be familiar with. I read Capital in that period too, probably. So I guess I was in my 20s.
Good time. What a transformation. Our next question is, when/how did you discover anarchism and syndicalism, and which anarchist, current or historical, inspired you to become an anarchist/syndicalist?
I was, it's an interesting thing. I was building this grassroots union, right, of teaching assistants at UCLA. And one of the people in that union, one of the people I was doing this with, was an anarcho-syndicalist. And he basically influenced me to move in this direction. He said, well, you should read about the Spanish Revolution. Well, I had never even known there was a Spanish Revolution. So I started reading things like Collectives in the Spanish Revolution by Gaston Laval, which is an eyewitness account of the mass expropriations of expropriated 80% of the economy in Spain's industrialized Northeast. It was incredible, incredibly impressive experience. And so that really was, I think, maybe the first thing that where I really did become committed to syndicalism at that point. So it wasn't really reading particular individuals, I don't think, although, I mean, there are, I did read people like Rudolf Rocker, but I think that it was basically reading about the actual revolution. that was what convinced me.
Yes, and we do have a question about, I'll skip ahead a little bit from through some of the questions here. Do you think the anarchist revolution in Spain, revolutionary Catalonia, was the best example for your vision for the revolution?
Yes, yes. Now the syndicalist it was a syndicalist union that was highly influenced by a variety of different anarchist tendencies within it. And it really was the largest example of what syndicalists call an expropriating general strike, where the unions, the worker activists, seized control of the various places they worked in, and they proceeded then to enact what they called socialization, which means that you take an industry like the entertainment industry. Well, they expropriated the assets of the vaudevilles and movie theaters and the motion picture industry, and they all merged them into a single organization and to run the entertainment industry in Spain. And so, yeah, that was like really impressive. And they built the first free-to-user healthcare system, socialized healthcare system in Spain's history. 40,000 people, doctors, nurses, pharmacists, with free clinics they've created, and they took over control of the hospitals and the drug factories, and so yeah, they went certainly very far along the process towards a libertarian form of socialism. They didn't complete the process because they didn't get to the point of getting rid of the state and creating a kind of federating the various industrial federations into planned and coordinated control over the whole economy. And they also built an army too, a proletarian army of 100,000 to smash the Spanish army, which they did in a large part of Spain. So yeah, that is certainly the best example we have. I mean, they made mistakes, and they demonstrated, for example, the importance of preparation, because they had spent decades of discussions of, well, what should we do in a revolutionary situation? And they had talked about taking over control of the workplaces and creating industrial federations. So they knew about that. Everybody was on board with that. They had these neighborhood storefront worker centers doing popular education on social theory, the politics of the labor movement, of the Syndicalist Union. They developed an incredible working class women's organization, Mujeres Libres, with 20 or 30,000 members, that to build around the sort of dual oppression of women, as both as women and as workers. So they really went a long ways. They did probably failed in some ways in their preparation, but certainly went a long ways.
Excellent. I agree. I agree that we can learn a lot from that example. We have a couple of more questions, or just a few more minutes, so I want to get into these. These next two questions are kind of all related to the same question. Which historic anarchists would you recommend people get into as the introductory to anarchism? What books would you recommend getting into anarchism? And what current anarchist would you want to work with today?
I'm not sure I really have a good answer to that question. Um, I mean, because there's a lot of different examples you can point to, right? And a lot of different, let's see, what would be good examples? So I guess I can't really answer the question of who I would recommend, because it's like what I usually do is I look at particular historical cases or particular movements and want to find out about that movement. So I want to find out about, say, the British anarchist movement, or the movement in Spain, or the various, like the Uruguayan Anarchist Federation, which is very interesting. But it's not like there's one particular person there. That was an organized movement that they built a huge rank and file organization in the unions there. And I mean, so it's more, I look more to movements, I guess, to organizations rather than to individuals.
That's a great point. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about some of these movements that have kind of stood out to you and given you pause, given you something to think about. If you would like to talk about them a little bit.
I'm not sure, I guess, I mean, it's like there's so many different things that you could talk about here in terms of movements, right? And that I think that like I say, I look to movements. So it's like, I think there are currently various inklings. If you look at grassroots, working class based sorts of movements, you can see inklings all around this country and in other countries too, of people making efforts at building unions, at building forms of organization to deal with environmental crisis. And so I would want to know more about them, right, rather than like some particular writer, I guess.
Great. Let's see. I'll take one more question from the chat here. What could the syndicalists do in order to deflect from outside forces trying to disrupt their revolution?
Is this about a particular revolution, or is it in general?
I think
you mean like if there was a revolution and there was like invasions or something, how would they deal with that? I can answer that.
Yeah.
So, well, basically that's where the militia comes into play, I mean, because syndicalism does propose that in a revolutionary situation, it's necessary to build a militia, an armed militia, for self-defense of the revolution. For that, indeed, in a revolutionary situation, it's a syndicalist principle that the worker mass organizations, the democratic organizations of the working class, have to end up in control of the dominant armed force. They don't want to end up with a situation where you have like some single party running the state and they have control of the army. Because what will happen in that situation, if that happened, is the people in power would then simply use that army to take all the industries back from the workers. And that happened in Spain. Towards the end of the Civil War, the communist controlled police were used to seize industries that workers had build organizations to control earlier on in the revolution. So yeah, so the working class has to have control over its own sort of militia, its own large armed organization. And it would be like an army basically against fascist forces or external invasions and things like that.
we're coming up on our time here, but one final question for you is what do you hope the reader to gain from reading Overcoming Capitalism? What do you hope that we walk away with?
Well, I hope that people get inspired to actually try and practice some of these things, in terms of things like building unions or other organizations that are of a self-managed character. I think that because that's why I emphasize so much strategy. So that's all about, well, what is the course of action that we're going to pursue? So it's a question of working to build democratic organizations, working to build unions that are democratically controlled by workers, building, what kinds of actions, course of actions, class struggle tactics, and so forth should be used. So it's basically about encouraging people to pursue a certain kind of course of action. That's the main thing that I want people to get out of it.
Great. Well, I feel inspired already by this conversation, so I think you're definitely on the right path. If we want to keep up with you and keep an eye on more of your work forthcoming or any other talks that you might be doing, where can we find you?
Well, let's see.
And
I
let's
actually have a blog that I'm setting up, but it hasn't been created. It's not online yet. It's called Overcoming Capitalism.info, but it's I'll be there eventually in the next couple of weeks, I guess.
Well, great. In the meantime, viewers, you can grab your copy of Overcoming Capitalism, give it a good read, and start drumming up ways that you can participate and participate in your community. Thank you so much, Tom, for joining us this evening. This has been a great conversation. I'm really glad we got to speak tonight.
Thank you.
Any final words for our viewers?
No, I think we've covered a lot of territory.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And thank you, viewers, for watching. You can grab your copy of Overcoming Capitalism at Lost City Books. You can stroll right up to our store on 18th Street in Washington, D.C., or you can hop onto our website, lostcitybookstore.com, and grab your copy there. Until next time, thank you again so much, Tom. Good night.
Good night.